Mughal Empire. Modern views on the decline. Since the 1970s, historians have taken multiple approaches to the decline, with little consensus on which factor was dominant. The psychological interpretations emphasize depravity in high places, excessive luxury, and increasingly narrow views that left the rulers unprepared for an external challenge. A Marxist school emphasizes excessive exploitation of the peasantry by the rich, which stripped away the will and the means to support the regime. Karen Leonard has focused on the failure of the regime to work with Hindu bankers, whose financial support was increasingly needed. The bankers then helped the Maratha and the British. In a religious interpretation, some scholars argue that the Hindu powers revolted against the rule of a Muslim dynasty. Finally, other scholars argue that the very prosperity of the empire inspired the provinces to achieve a high degree of independence, thus weakening the imperial court. Geoffrey G. Williamson has argued that the Indian economy went through deindustrialization in the latter half of the 18th century as an indirect outcome of the collapse of the Mughal Empire, with British rule later causing further deindustrialization. According to Williamson, the decline of the Mughal Empire led to a decline in agricultural productivity, which drove up food prices, then nominal wages, and then textile prices, which led to India losing a share of the world textile market to Britain even before it had superior factory technology. Indian textiles, however, still maintained a competitive advantage over British textiles up until the 19th century. Administrative divisions. Suba was the term for a province in the Mughal Empire. The word is derived from Arabic. The governor of a Suba was known as a Subadar, which later became Subedar to refer to an officer in the Indian army. The Subas were established by Padshah Akbar during his administrative reforms of 1572 to 1580. Initially, they numbered 12, but his conquests expanded the number of Subas to 15 by the end of his reign. Subas were divided into Sarkars or districts. Sarkars were further divided into Paganas or Mahals. His successors, most notably Aurangzeb, expanded the number of Subas further through their conquests. As the empire began to dissolve in the early 18th century, many Subas became effectively independent, or were conquered by the Marathas or the British. The original 12 Subas created as a result of administrative reform by Akbar. Agra Suba, Ajmer Suba, Awadh Suba, Bengal Suba, Bihar Suba, Delhi Suba, Gujarat Suba, Kabul Suba, Allahabad Suba, Lahore Suba, Malwa Suba, Multan Suba. Economy. The Indian economy was large and prosperous under the Mughal Empire. During the Mughal era, the gross domestic product of India in 1600 was estimated at about 22% of the world economy, the second largest in the world, behind only Ming China but larger than Europe. By 1700, the GDP of Mughal India had risen to 24% of the world economy, the largest in the world, larger than both King China and Western Europe. Mughal India was the world leader in manufacturing, producing about 25% of the world's industrial output up until the 18th century. India's GDP growth increased under the Mughal Empire, with India's GDP having a faster growth rate during the Mughal era than in the 1500 years prior to the Mughal era. Mughal India's economy has been described as a form of proto-industrialization, like that of 18th century Western Europe prior to the Industrial Revolution. The Mughals were responsible for building an extensive road system, creating a uniform currency, and the unification of the country. The empire had an extensive road network, which was vital to the economic infrastructure, built by a public works department set up by the Mughals, which designed, constructed and maintained roads linking towns and cities across the empire, making trade easier to conduct. The main base of the empire's collective wealth was agricultural taxes, instituted by the third Mughal emperor, Akbar. These taxes, which amounted to well over half the output of a peasant cultivator, were paid in the well-regulated silver currency, and caused peasants and artisans to enter larger markets. Coinage. The Mughals adopted and standardized the rupee and dam currencies introduced by Sur Emperor Sher Shah Suri during his brief rule. The currency was initially 48 dams to a single rupee in the beginning of Akbar's reign, before it later became 38 dams to a rupee in the 1580s, with the dam's value rising further in the 17th century as a result of new industrial uses for copper, such as in bronze cannons and brass utensils. The dam was initially the most common coin in Akbar's time, before being replaced by the rupee as the most common coin in succeeding reigns. The dam's value was later worth 30 to a rupee towards the end of Jahangir's reign, and then 16 to a rupee by the 1660s. The Mughals minted coins with high purity, never dropping below 96%, and without debasement until the 1720s. Despite India having its own stocks of gold and silver, the Mughals produced minimal gold of their own, but mostly minted coins from imported bullion as a result of the empire's strong export-driven economy, with global demand for Indian agricultural and industrial products drawing a steady stream of precious metals into India. Around 80% of Mughal India's imports were bullion, mostly silver, with major sources of imported bullion including the New World and Japan, which in turn imported large quantities of textiles and silk from the Bengal Suba province. Labor. The Mughal Empire's workforce in the early 17th century consisted of about 64% in the primary sector, over 11% in the secondary sector, and about 25% in the tertiary sector. Mughal India's workforce had a higher percentage in the non-primary sector than Europe's workforce did at the time. Agriculture accounted for 65 to 90% of Europe's workforce in 1700 and 65 to 75% in 1750, including 65% of England's workforce in 1750. Historian Shireen Muswi estimates that in terms of contributions to the Mughal economy, in the late 16th century, the primary sector contributed 52%, the secondary sector 18% and the tertiary sector 29%. The secondary sector contributed a higher percentage than in early 20th century British India, where the secondary sector only contributed 11% to the economy. In terms of urban-rural divide, 18% of Mughal India's labour force were urban and 82% were rural, contributing 52% and 48% to the economy, respectively. Real wages and living standards in 18th century Mughal Bengal and South India were higher than in Britain, which in turn had the highest living standards in Europe. According to economic historian Paul Bairoch, India as well as China had a higher GNP per capita than Europe up until the late 18th century, before Western European per capita income pulled ahead after 1800. According to Muswi, Mughal India also had a per capita income 1.24% higher in the late 16th century than British India did in the early 20th century. However, in a system where wealth was hoarded by elites, wages were depressed for manual labour, though no less than labour wages in Europe at the time. In Mughal India, there was a generally tolerant attitude towards manual labourers, with some religious cults in northern India proudly asserting a high status for manual labour. While slavery also existed, it was limited largely to household servants. Agriculture. Indian agricultural production increased under the Mughal Empire. A variety of crops were grown, including food crops such as wheat, rice, and barley, and non-food cash crops such as cotton, indigo and opium. By the mid-17th century, Indian cultivators began to extensively grow two new crops from the Americas, maize and tobacco. The Mughal administration emphasized agrarian reform, which began under the non-Mughal emperor Sher Shah Suri, the work of which Akbar adopted and furthered with more reforms. The civil administration was organized in a hierarchical manner on the basis of merit, with promotions based on performance. The Mughal government funded the building of irrigation systems across the empire, which produced much higher crop yields and increased the net revenue base, leading to increased agricultural production. A major Mughal reform introduced by Akbar was a new land revenue system called Zabt. He replaced the tribute system, previously common in India and used by Tokugawa Japan at the time, with a monetary tax system based on a uniform currency. The revenue system was biased in favor of higher value cash crops such as cotton, indigo, sugarcane, tree crops, and opium, providing state incentives to grow cash crops, in addition to rising market demand. Under the Zabt system, the Mughals also conducted extensive cadastral surveying to assess the area of land under plough cultivation, with the Mughal state encouraging greater land cultivation by offering tax-free periods to those who brought new land under cultivation. The expansion of agriculture and cultivation continued under later Mughal emperors including Aurangzeb, whose 1665 Firman edict stated, "The entire elevated attention and desires of the emperor are devoted to the increase in the population and cultivation of the empire and the welfare of the whole peasantry and the entire people." Mughal agriculture was in some ways advanced compared to European agriculture at the time, exemplified by the common use of the seed drill among Indian peasants before its adoption in Europe. While the average peasant across the world was only skilled in growing very few crops, the average Indian peasant was skilled in growing a wide variety of food and non-food crops, increasing their productivity. Indian peasants were also quick to adapt to profitable new crops, such as maize and tobacco from the New World being rapidly adopted and widely cultivated across Mughal India between 1600 and 1650. Bengali farmers rapidly learned techniques of mulberry cultivation and sericulture, establishing Bengal Suba as a major silk-producing region of the world. Sugar mills appeared in India shortly before the Mughal era. Evidence for the use of a drawbar for sugar milling appears at Delhi in 1540, but may also date back earlier and was mainly used in the northern Indian subcontinent. Geared sugar rolling mills first appeared in Mughal India, using the principle of rollers as well as worm gearing, by the 17th century. According to economic historian Emmanuel Wallerstein, citing evidence from Irfan Habib, Percival Spear, and Ashok Desai, per capita agricultural output and standards of consumption in 17th century Mughal India were probably higher than in 17th century Europe and certainly higher than early 20th century British India. The increased agricultural productivity led to lower food prices. In turn, this benefited the Indian textile industry. Compared to Britain, the price of grain was about one-half in South India and one-third in Bengal, in terms of silver coinage. This resulted in lower silver coin prices for Indian textiles, giving them a price advantage in global markets.